Emily Carter had already lost her husband. Then, in a single night, a devastating flood washed away the small vegetable farm they had spent 20 years building together, with no savings, no harvest, and bills piling up faster than she could count them. Everyone expected the widowed farmer to do the only sensible thing, sell the land and walk away. But instead, Emily made a decision that left her neighbors shaking their heads. Some called her stubborn. Others quietly said she was chasing a dream that had already drowned. Then, while digging through the wreckage left behind by the flood, she discovered a weatherproof box containing her late husband's old notebook. And what she found inside would change not only her future, but the future of an entire community. But before I tell you what was written on those pages, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I love seeing how far these stories travel. If it's morning where you are, I hope you have a wonderful day ahead. And if you enjoy inspiring stories about resilience, kindness, and second chances, please leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and join us for the rest of Emily's unforgettable journey. Emily Carter stood ankle-deep in cold brown water where rows of crisp lettuce, tomatoes, peppers, and beans had been growing only 2 days earlier. The flood had come during the night with a force no one in the county had expected, spilling over the riverbanks after days of relentless rain. By sunrise, it had already begun to retreat, leaving behind a field covered in thick mud, broken fencing, tangled branches, and shattered pieces of the small greenhouse she and her husband had built with their own hands almost 20 years before. She pulled her jacket tighter against the damp morning air, but nothing could keep away the emptiness settling inside her. Since her husband, David, had passed away 2 years earlier, this little vegetable farm had become more than a business. It was the last place where she still felt close to him. Every fence post, every raised bed, every fruit tree carried a memory of the life they had shared. Now those memories looked as broken as the land itself. Emily slowly walked toward what remained of the greenhouse. Twisted metal frames leaned against each other, cracked plastic sheets flapped in the breeze, and seed trays floated in muddy puddles. She picked up one tray out of habit before realizing every seedling inside had drowned. She quietly set it back down. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, but she ignored it. There would be insurance calls, county reports, suppliers asking questions she couldn't answer, and bills she had no idea how to pay. Right now, she simply wasn't ready to hear another reminder of everything she had lost. The screen door of the farmhouse creaked open behind her. "Mom!" Noah called. At 18, he looked more like his father every year. He carefully stepped around the mud until he reached her side. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally, he sighed. "It's worse than I thought." Emily nodded without taking her eyes off the field. "The entire spring crop is gone." Noah looked across the damage before speaking again. Maybe this is the sign we've been ignoring." She knew what he meant before he finished. "We could sell the place," he said quietly. "Use whatever's left to pay the debts. You don't have to keep doing this alone." Emily closed her eyes for a moment. She had heard the same advice from friends after David's funeral. Sell the farm, move somewhere easier, start over. But every time she imagined leaving, it felt like saying goodbye to David all over again. "Not yet," she answered softly. Noah rubbed the back of his neck. "Mom, I'm worried about you. I know." She finally looked at him and managed a faint smile. "But I'm not ready to walk away." He didn't argue. Instead, he bent down and began lifting broken boards into a pile beside the path. Emily joined him. They worked quietly for nearly an hour, clearing debris from around the farmhouse before moving toward the equipment shed. One corner of the roof had collapsed, but the small storage cabinet inside was still standing. Together they shifted a fallen beam just enough for Emily to squeeze through the opening. Most of the tools were ruined, coated in muddy water, but as she searched the shelves, she noticed a familiar gray waterproof box tucked behind an old toolbox. Her heartbeat quickened. She wiped away the mud and carefully opened the lid. Inside lay a worn notebook wrapped in a plastic bag. David had always carried it during planting season, filling its pages with crop plans, weather notes, and thoughts he never shared aloud. Somehow it had survived untouched. Emily held the notebook against her chest as if she had recovered a piece of him the flood had failed to steal. Before she could open it, another vibration came from her phone. This time she answered. The voice from the bank was calm but firm. Because of the extensive flood damage, an official property assessment would take place in 3 weeks. Depending on the results, they would discuss the future of her loan. Emily thanked the representative, ended the call, and stared across the ruined fields once more. 3 weeks. That was all the time she had left to save the farm. The next morning, Emily carried a clipboard across the farm, determined to learn exactly how much had been lost instead of guessing. She moved from one ruined section to another, making careful notes despite the ache in her hands. The irrigation lines were buried beneath silt. The wooden raised beds nearest the creek had been ripped apart. Half the fencing would have to be replaced, and the greenhouse was beyond repair. She opened the equipment shed again and checked each machine. The small tiller refused to start after sitting underwater. The water pump was ruined. Even the hand tools she could still use were already beginning to rust. Every new number she wrote made the total climb higher than she wanted to imagine. By noon, she sat on the farmhouse porch with a calculator, stacks of invoices, and the notebook from the bank. Repairing only the essentials would cost far more than the savings left in her account. Rebuilding everything seemed impossible. Noah stepped outside carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to his mother before sitting beside her. Neither of them spoke immediately. They simply looked across the muddy fields where green rows had stretched only days before. "How bad?" he finally asked. Emily turned the clipboard toward him. "Worse than I hoped." He scanned the estimates and slowly lowered the papers. "Insurance won't cover this?" "Some of it." "Not enough," Noah nodded, already understanding the answer. "You don't have to figure this out alone." Emily appreciated the words, even if she had no idea what help anyone could really offer. She reached over and squeezed his hand. "We'll keep looking at every option." After lunch, they continued inspecting the property together. Along the backfield, they found patches where the soil had not completely washed away. Noah knelt, picked up a handful of dirt, and let it crumble through his fingers. "Maybe this part isn't ruined." Emily wished she could agree. But years of farming had taught her patience. Good soil could survive a flood, but only after careful testing and treatment. Hope alone would not bring back a harvest. Later that afternoon, an old pickup truck pulled into the driveway. Grace Miller climbed out carrying 2 covered dishes balanced carefully in her arms. She had lived on the neighboring farm for nearly 30 years and had been one of David's closest friends. "I figured neither of you had remembered to eat," she said with a gentle smile. Emily welcomed her inside. The smell of homemade chicken stew quickly filled the kitchen, making the house feel warmer than it had since the flood. As they ate, Grace listened without interrupting while Emily explained the damage and the upcoming bank assessment. When Emily finished, Grace reached across the table. "You're stronger than you think." Emily gave a tired smile. "Strength doesn't buy lumber." Grace laughed softly, then grew serious again. "No, but it helps you keep standing long enough to find another way." Before leaving, Grace hugged Emily tightly. "Call me if you need anything at all." After she drove away, Emily and Noah headed into town to visit Ben Alvarez's farm supply store. Ben walked around the counter the moment he saw them. I heard about the flood. I'm sorry. Emily thanked him and explained what equipment had been destroyed. Ben listened carefully before pulling out a notepad. The good news, he said, is the land itself isn't necessarily lost. Floodwater looks terrible, but healthy soil can recover if you move quickly. It'll take work, compost, testing, and time, but I've seen farms come back. For the first time since the disaster, Emily heard something that sounded almost like hope. The bad news, she asked. Ben hesitated before answering. Everything needed to do that costs money. Emily managed a quiet laugh despite herself. That's exactly what I don't have. Ben looked genuinely disappointed. I wish I had a better answer. They thanked him and returned home before sunset. Emily spread the invoices across the dining room table one more time. She compared the repair estimates with her savings until there was no point continuing. The numbers simply refused to meet. Slowly, she opened a folder containing the property deed and the paperwork she had always promised herself she would never use. Noah watched silently from the doorway as she filled out the first forms required to list the farm for sale. When she finally signed the last page, she set down the pen and stared at the family name printed across the top, wondering if this was how 20 years of dreams were supposed to end. The house felt unusually quiet the following evening. After finishing another long day of clearing debris from the yard, Emily carried David's weathered notebook to the kitchen table. She had been reluctant to open it, afraid the familiar handwriting would make the loss feel fresh again. Noah noticed the notebook in front of her and quietly sat across from his mother without saying a word. Emily took a slow breath before unfolding the protective plastic bag and opening the first page. She expected crop schedules, fertilizer measurements, and rainfall records. Instead, she found a simple handwritten sentence at the top. Never forget that people matter more than harvests. She smiled faintly. That sounds like your father. Noah nodded. It does. As Emily turned the pages, she found planting dates and sketches of the fields mixed with something she had never seen before. David had recorded moments that had nothing to do with farming. One page described delivering boxes of fresh vegetables to the local food pantry during a summer when donations had run low. Another mentioned repairing an elderly neighbor's fence after a windstorm because the man could not afford the lumber. A later entry listed several names besides short notes. Helped the Martins start their first garden. Paid for seed potatoes after the Wilson family's tractor broke. Dropped produce at the Johnson house every Friday while Mrs. Johnson recovered from surgery. Never mention it again. Emily traced her fingers over the faded ink. She remembered every one of those moments now. At the time, they had never seemed extraordinary. She and David had simply done what they believed neighbors should do. They had never expected anything in return. Noah leaned closer. I didn't know Dad wrote all this down. Neither did I. Emily carefully turned another page. More names appeared. Some belonged to families who had since moved away. Others still lived in town. Beside many entries, David had added only a few words. Needed encouragement. Hard winter. Quiet visit. Don't let them feel alone. Emily felt tears forming, but continued reading. It was less a journal than a quiet record of kindness, written without pride or recognition. She realized that even after 20 years of marriage, there were acts of generosity her husband had never spoken about. He never wanted anyone to know, she whispered. Noah smiled sadly. That sounds exactly like him. They spent the next hour reading together. Every few pages, one of them would stop and remember a face, a conversation, or a delivery made years before. The notebook slowly became less painful and more comforting, as if David were still sitting with them, reminding them what truly mattered. The peaceful moment ended when Emily glanced toward the growing stack of unpaid bills on the counter. She gathered them together and compared the totals once again with the balance in her checking account. Nothing had changed. The electricity bill, equipment payments, property taxes, and loan notices still demanded attention. The notebook offered comfort, but it could not pay what was owed. Noah looked at the paperwork. "Maybe we should call the real estate agent tomorrow." Emily rested her hand on the sale documents without opening them. "Maybe." She hated how easily the word escaped her mouth. Selling the farm still felt impossible, yet keeping it looked just as unrealistic. The numbers left little room for hope. Early the next morning, Emily walked into town to mail several required insurance forms. As she crossed Main Street, she recognized a few familiar faces from the notebook. Mrs. Johnson waved warmly from outside the bakery. Mr. Wilson tipped his hat as he loaded supplies into his truck. Emily smiled politely, but never mentioned what she had been reading. She doubted any of them even remembered the small favors David had recorded years earlier. People moved on with their lives. That was natural. Returning home, she found Grace waiting on the porch with a basket of fresh bread. "Thought you could use this," Grace said. Emily thanked her and invited her inside for coffee. During their conversation, Emily mentioned discovering David's notebook. She handed it across the table. Grace slowly read several entries before looking up with misty eyes. "He kept track of all this?" Emily nodded. "I had no idea." Grace smiled gently. "Neither did most of us." She closed the notebook with great care. "Your husband never wanted praise. The two of you helped people because it was the right thing to do." Emily shrugged. "They were all small things." "Small things," Grace replied, "can stay in people's hearts longer than we realize." Emily appreciated the sentiment, but looked toward the bills again. Kind memories would not satisfy the bank in less than 3 weeks. Grace noticed the paperwork, but chose not to argue. Instead, she stood, hugged Emily, and promised to check in again soon. After leaving the farmhouse, Grace sat in her truck for several quiet moments. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and scrolled through her contacts. One by one, she began making calls to people throughout the community, starting each conversation the same way. "Do you remember what David and Emily once did for your family?" 3 days after Grace began making phone calls, she invited Emily to a community meeting at the small church near the center of town. Emily almost declined. She was exhausted, embarrassed by the condition of her farm, and convinced everyone had more important problems than hers. Grace refused to accept no for an answer. "Just come," she said with a reassuring smile. "No speeches, no pressure." Emily reluctantly agreed. When she and Noah walked into the fellowship hall that evening, she stopped in surprise. Nearly 30 people had gathered around folding tables with coffee, homemade desserts, and handwritten notes spread across the room. Many were neighbors she had known for years. Others were families she recognized only vaguely from the farmers' market or local events. Conversations quieted as she entered, and Emily immediately felt uncomfortable with every pair of eyes turning toward her. Grace stepped forward before the silence became awkward. "Emily, we're glad you came." Emily forced a smile. "I don't really know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Grace replied. "Just listen." Pastor Daniel Brooks welcomed everyone and offered a brief prayer for families recovering from the flood. He spoke about neighbors carrying one another through difficult seasons, reminding everyone that hardship rarely lasted forever when a community faced it together. Emily appreciated his words, but still believed she had come only for encouragement. Then Grace placed a small wooden basket on the table. "We're starting with this," she said. One by one, people walked forward. Some dropped folded bills into the basket. Others added envelopes. A retired couple contributed a gift card to the hardware store. Someone else offered fuel for tractors. Another family promised several weekends of labor if rebuilding ever became possible. Emily's face grew warm. She instinctively shook her head. "Please, you don't have to do this." Grace gently touched her arm. "We know we don't have to. I can't ask people for money." "You didn't ask," Grace answered. "That's the point." Emily looked around the room, overwhelmed by both gratitude and discomfort. She had always preferred giving help, not receiving it. Standing there while neighbors quietly offered what they could felt strangely harder than spending days cleaning mud alone. Noah noticed the expression on her face. "Mom," he whispered, "they want to help." Emily swallowed hard. "I know." Ben Alvarez arrived a few minutes later carrying a folder. He greeted Emily with a warm handshake before opening the papers. "I've been making a few calls myself," he said. "I can't replace everything, but my store can provide seed, fertilizer, and basic supplies on credit. No interest. Pay when you're able." Emily stared at him. "Ben, that's too much." He smiled. "Years ago, when I opened my business, your family bought supplies from me even when everyone else was driving to the big chain stores in the next county. You kept this place alive during my first year. I'm only returning the favor." Emily remembered those early days, but had never imagined they meant so much to him. She thanked him quietly, struggling to keep her voice steady. By the end of the evening, the donations filled only part of the basket. Emily knew the amount would barely cover a fraction of the repairs listed on her clipboard. Even so, every envelope represented someone choosing to stand beside her. It was impossible not to feel moved. As people prepared to leave, a young woman carrying a camera bag introduced herself. "Emily, I'm Sarah Kim with the County Gazette." Emily looked uncertain. "I'm not sure there's much of a story here." Sarah smiled kindly. "I think there is." Grace explained that she had mentioned Emily's situation during one of their conversations. Sarah had originally been covering flood damage across the county, but after hearing about the gathering, she wanted to learn more. "I'm not interested in writing about disaster alone," Sarah said. "I'm interested in people." Emily hesitated. She disliked attention and had spent her entire life avoiding the spotlight. "I don't want anyone feeling sorry for me. That's not the story I'd write," Sarah replied. "I'd rather tell people about a community trying to help one of its own." Emily glanced toward Grace, who offered an encouraging nod. After a long pause, Emily agreed to answer a few questions. Sarah asked about the flood, the history of the farm, and David. Emily spoke simply, avoiding exaggeration. She explained how the farm had been built one season at a time, and how losing it felt like losing another piece of her husband. She also insisted on mentioning the kindness already shown by neighbors, instead of focusing only on her own struggles. Sarah took careful notes without interrupting. Before leaving, she closed her notebook. "Thank you for trusting me," she said. "The article will run this weekend." Emily walked outside with Noah after the meeting ended. The cool evening air carried the scent of wet earth from fields still recovering across the valley. She held the basket of donations carefully in both hands. "It's generous," she said softly. "But it still isn't enough." Noah looked at her. "Maybe not yet." Emily managed a tired smile, though uncertainty remained heavy on her shoulders. As they drove home beneath the fading sunset, Sarah sat at her own desk in the newspaper office, reviewing her notes before beginning the opening paragraph of a story that neither she nor Emily yet realized would reach far beyond their small town. Sarah's article appeared in the Saturday edition of the County Gazette beneath a simple headline about a widow, a flooded vegetable farm, and a community refusing to let hope disappear. Emily almost skipped reading it, worried it would make her seem helpless. But Noah placed the newspaper on the kitchen table anyway. The story was honest. It described the flood, David's years of hard work, the small church gathering, and the neighbors already offering what they could. Most importantly, Sarah had written about kindness instead of tragedy. Emily folded the paper carefully after finishing the last paragraph. "She told the truth," she said quietly. Noah smiled. She did. By afternoon, the article had spread far beyond the printed newspaper. Friends shared it online. Former residents of the town passed it along to relatives. Messages began arriving through the newspaper office, then through Grace, and finally through Emily's own phone. Some simply offered prayers. Others shared memories of buying vegetables from the Carter farm every summer. Several included small electronic donations with notes that read, "For seeds, for rebuilding," or "For a second chance." None of the amounts were large, but together they slowly began to grow. Emily checked the total only once that evening before putting the phone away. She refused to let herself expect too much. The next few days settled into a steady rhythm. Each morning, she and Noah cleared another section of the property. Broken fencing was stacked into piles. Mud was shoveled from the barn. Damaged irrigation pipe was sorted into pieces that might still be repaired. The work was slow and exhausting, yet the farm looked a little less defeated each day. Every afternoon, another donation arrived. Sometimes it was $20, sometimes $50. Once, a retired teacher mailed a handwritten note with $10 tucked inside and apologized because she wished she could send more. Emily read every card and saved each one in a kitchen drawer. "People really care," Noah said one evening while helping organize the envelopes. Emily nodded. "I just hope we can make their kindness count." Even with the growing support, the numbers remained discouraging. Ben visited the farm to review the cost of seed, compost, replacement irrigation lines, and greenhouse materials. He crossed out several prices, lowering them as much as he could. "This is the best I can do," he admitted. Emily thanked him sincerely, but after comparing the estimate with the donations collected so far, there was still a painful gap. Ben noticed her expression. "Don't give up yet." "I'm trying not to." He looked toward the empty fields. "The biggest challenge isn't only money anymore. It's time. If planting season slips away, you'll lose another year." Those words stayed with Emily long after he left. Every day that passed shortened the window for getting crops into the ground. She walked through the back field that evening, remembering the excitement she and David had always felt during spring planting. Instead of fresh green rows, she saw bare earth, waiting for work that still seemed beyond reach. Later that night, she opened David's notebook again. She reread the entries about helping neighbors through difficult seasons. None of them mentioned expecting repayment. They simply reflected a belief that kindness was worth offering even when no reward was guaranteed. Emily closed the notebook with a quiet smile. "I hope you were right," she whispered. Across town, Sarah continued receiving emails about the article. Some readers asked how they could help. Others wanted to volunteer if rebuilding ever began. She forwarded several messages to Grace, who carefully recorded names and phone numbers without making promises she could not yet keep. Grace called Emily the next afternoon. "More people have reached out." Emily sounded grateful but cautious. "Please thank them for me." "You can thank them yourself someday," Grace replied. "Right now, just keep believing." Noah overheard the conversation and looked at his mother after she hung up. "A week ago, you were ready to sell." Emily glanced toward the folder containing the unfinished paperwork. "I still don't know what happens next." "But you haven't mailed it." She looked at the folder for a long moment before quietly sliding it into a kitchen drawer instead of placing it by the front door with the outgoing mail. "Not yet," she said. Early the following morning, before sunrise, Emily stepped outside carrying a shovel, intending to begin clearing another damaged section near the greenhouse. As she reached the driveway, the distant sound of engines echoed along the quiet country road. She looked up to see a pickup truck turning toward the farm, followed by another, then another, and behind them several more vehicles pulling trailers loaded with tools, lumber, and equipment. By the time the first truck stopped in front of the farmhouse, a long line of volunteers had filled the driveway, and people were already climbing out with work gloves in their hands. Emily stood frozen on the porch as the convoy came to a stop. Pickup doors opened one after another, and men, women, and teenagers climbed out carrying shovels, rakes, wheelbarrows, work gloves, and toolboxes. Some she recognized immediately. Others looked familiar but older than she remembered. Grace stepped from the first truck with a bright smile. "I told a few people," she said. "They told a few more." Pastor Daniel followed, greeting volunteers before organizing them into small groups. "Let's make sure everyone has a job," he called. "Safety first. Pace yourselves." Emily looked from one face to another, struggling to find words. I don't know what to say." Grace squeezed her shoulder. "You don't have to. Just let us work." Within minutes, the quiet farm was filled with purposeful activity. One team cleared broken branches from the fields, another hauled twisted greenhouse frames into scrap piles. Several volunteers shoveled thick layers of mud away from the barn doors, while others repaired sections of damaged fencing. Noah joined a group unloading lumber from a trailer, surprised by how naturally everyone worked together despite coming from different parts of the county. Emily tried to thank every person she passed, but after the 10th conversation she realized she could never keep up. A middle-aged man pushing a wheelbarrow stopped beside her. "You probably don't remember me," he said with a grin. "I'm Jason Martin." Emily studied his face before recognition slowly appeared. "The Martins. Your family started a garden years ago." Jason laughed. "With vegetables your husband insisted we take, even though we couldn't afford them." Emily smiled softly. "That was a long time ago." Jason nodded. "It was. My kids grew up eating food from that garden. Today they're over there helping clear your fields." He pointed toward two teenagers lifting broken fence posts into a trailer. "We never forgot what your family did for us." Before Emily could respond, Jason picked up his wheelbarrow again and returned to work. His words lingered in her mind long after he walked away. Throughout the morning, similar conversations unfolded. An elderly woman brought homemade sandwiches and reminded Emily of the fresh produce delivered during her husband's illness. A young couple explained that David had once spent an entire Saturday repairing their irrigation pump without accepting payment. Emily had remembered some of those moments from the notebook, but hearing them through the voices of the people who had lived them gave each memory new meaning. By lunchtime, dozens of volunteers gathered beneath a shade tree to eat together. Laughter mixed with tired conversation, as if they had been working on the same farm for years. Emily stood quietly with a paper plate in her hands, overwhelmed by the sight. Tears finally slipped down her cheeks. She quickly turned away, embarrassed. But Grace noticed and gently wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "It's all right," Grace whispered. "You don't have to be strong every minute." Emily wiped her eyes. "I thought I was completely alone." "You never were," Grace replied. "You just didn't know how many lives you and David had touched." After lunch, the work continued with renewed energy. Ben arrived driving a flatbed truck stacked with construction materials. Fresh lumber, metal supports, fasteners, and rolls of greenhouse covering filled the trailer. Several volunteers hurried over to help unload. Emily walked toward Ben in disbelief. "I thought this would have to wait." Ben smiled. "A local building supplier heard about your farm after reading Sarah's article. They donated most of the materials. My store covered the rest." Emily looked at the growing stacks beside the damaged greenhouse. "This is incredible." "Now comes the hard part," Ben said, glancing toward the twisted frame still standing in the field. "The old greenhouse can't be patched. It has to come down completely before we can build another." Emily stared at the wreckage, Tearing it down felt painful because she and David had built it together, board by board, during their first profitable season. Yet leaving it standing served no purpose. She took a deep breath, picked up a wrench, and handed another to Noah. Then let's start over. Together they loosened bolts while volunteers carefully dismantled the damaged structure piece by piece. By late afternoon, the broken frame was gone, leaving only a level foundation waiting for something new. As the sun dipped lower, a volunteer approached Pastor Daniel with a clipboard. More churches, civic groups, and neighbors had called throughout the day asking if additional help was still needed. Pastor Daniel smiled before walking over to Emily. "I think you should know," he said. "This morning was only the beginning. More teams have signed up to come over the next several days." Emily looked across the busy farm where people were still working despite their exhaustion. The empty fields no longer felt silent. For the first time since the flood, they sounded alive, yet with so much still left to rebuild. She wondered whether this extraordinary wave of kindness could last long enough to give the farm a genuine second chance. The days that followed became a race against the calendar. Every sunrise brought another list of jobs, and every sunset revealed how much still remained to be done. Volunteers continued arriving in shifts, some for a few hours before work, others for entire weekends. Together they finished rebuilding the greenhouse frame, repaired long sections of fencing, and spread fresh compost across the fields that Ben had identified as ready for planting. The farm still carried the scars of the flood, but it no longer looked abandoned. It looked determined. Emily walked the rows with Ben early one morning as they checked the soil. He knelt, scooped up a handful of dark earth, and crumbled it between his fingers. "It's improving," he said. "The drainage work made a difference. It's not perfect, but it's ready." Emily looked across the prepared beds, hardly believing she was hearing those words. "You really think we can plant?" Ben smiled. "If you wait much longer, you'll miss the season. If you start now, you've got a chance." A chance. It wasn't a promise, but after everything that had happened, it was enough. Later that afternoon, boxes of seeds arrived from Ben's store. Tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, beans, lettuce, squash, and herbs were carefully stacked inside the rebuilt greenhouse. Emily ran her hand across one of the packets, remembering the excitement she and David had always shared on planting day. Every spring they would stand together before the first seed went into the ground, believing that months of work could begin with something small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. She closed her eyes for a moment, silently thanking him for every lesson he had left behind. Noah stepped beside her, carrying seed trays. "Ready?" he asked. Emily nodded. "Let's grow something again." They began with the greenhouse, filling trays with fresh soil, while volunteers organized irrigation hoses and prepared planting beds outside. The work felt completely different from clearing mud. Instead of removing destruction, they were creating the future, one seed at a time. Emily carefully pressed the first tomato seed into the soil, covered it gently, and smiled through tears. She no longer tried to hide around her. Conversations and laughter drifted through the greenhouse. Hope sounded remarkably similar to ordinary work during a short lunch break. Noah sat beside his mother on overturned buckets near the greenhouse entrance. They watched volunteers finishing another section of irrigation pipe. "I've been thinking," he said. Emily looked at him. "About what?" "About leaving." She remained quiet, allowing him to continue. "After Dad died, I thought staying here was only making things harder for you. Then after the flood, I was sure selling was the only answer." He glanced toward the busy fields. "I was wrong." Emily reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "You were trying to protect me." "Maybe." He smiled. "But I don't want to leave anymore. If you'll have me, I'd like to stay and help run the farm. Emily felt emotion catch in her throat. For weeks, she had feared she might rebuild everything only to face it alone. I'd like that very much, she whispered. They returned to work side by side, no longer simply as mother and son, but as partners sharing the same dream. By late afternoon, the final trays were placed inside the greenhouse, and several outdoor beds had already been planted. Ben inspected the newly installed drainage channels running alongside the fields. These should carry away heavy rain much better than before, he explained. The old system wasn't designed for flooding like that. This one gives the water somewhere to go. Emily studied the shallow channels stretching across the property. They represented another improvement made possible only because so many people had contributed their time and skills. The farm was not being rebuilt exactly as it had been. It was becoming stronger. Just as the last tools were being put away, Grace walked toward the group carrying her phone. I hate to interrupt, she said, but the weather forecast just updated. Everyone gathered around as she read the report. A strong storm system was expected to move through the county within the next 24 hours, bringing the possibility of heavy rain. An uneasy silence settled over the group. Emily instinctively looked toward the freshly planted fields. The seeds had barely reached the ground. Noah noticed the worry on her face. The drainage is better now, he reminded her. Ben nodded. It is. We built it for exactly this reason. Emily wanted to believe him. She had seen the improvements with her own eyes, yet memories of the flood remained painfully fresh. That evening, after the volunteers headed home, she stood alone near the edge of the field as dark clouds slowly gathered along the western horizon. The wind carried the cool scent of approaching rain, and the first distant rumble of thunder echoed across the valley. She whispered a quiet prayer, hoping this time the land she loved would finally be ready for whatever the sky was about to bring. Rain began shortly after midnight, tapping softly against the farmhouse windows before growing steadier as the hours passed. Emily barely slept. Each time thunder rolled across the valley, she found herself standing at the living room window, staring into the darkness where the fields disappeared beneath sheets of falling water. Memories of the flood returned with every gust of wind. And although Ben had assured her the new drainage system was ready, fear was not easily erased. Before sunrise, she pulled on her boots and hurried outside with Noah close behind. The rain had already begun to ease. Together, they walked to the nearest planting beds, expecting to find standing water. Instead, they watched muddy runoff flow steadily through the newly dug drainage channels and away from the fields. The soil remained damp but intact. Emily knelt, pressed her hand against the ground, and let out a slow breath she felt she had been holding for days. It worked, Noah said with a smile. Ben arrived later that morning to inspect the property for himself. After checking several sections of the farm, he nodded with quiet satisfaction. Exactly what we hoped for, he said. The water moved where it was supposed to go. Emily looked across the fields glistening beneath the clearing sky. For the first time since the flood, rain no longer felt like an enemy. Over the following weeks, the farm slowly changed color. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil in neat rows, first in the greenhouse and then across the outdoor beds. Every morning, Emily walked the fields before breakfast, smiling each time she spotted another patch of young leaves. She had seen seedlings emerge countless times during her years of farming, yet this season felt entirely different. Every sprout represented a promise that the farm still had a future. Volunteers continued stopping by, though now many simply wanted to admire the progress. Grace often brought coffee while chatting with Emily among the growing vegetables. Pastor Daniel organized a small group from the church to help weed the fields one Saturday morning. Children who had helped clear debris weeks earlier proudly pointed out rows they remembered planting. The farm had become more than Emily's workplace again. It had become a place where people gathered. One afternoon, Sarah returned, carrying her camera. She smiled as she looked across the rows of healthy plants. "This hardly looks like the same farm I visited after the flood." Emily laughed softly. "Some days it doesn't feel like the same farm." Sarah walked through the greenhouse, taking photographs of seedlings stretching toward the sunlight. She interviewed several volunteers before speaking privately with Emily. "People have been asking how you're doing," Sarah said. "I think they'd like to know what their support helped accomplish." Emily looked around the greenhouse. "Tell them every dollar, every hour, and every kind word mattered." Sarah nodded. "Anything else?" Emily thought for a moment. "Tell them hope grows faster when people share it." Sarah smiled and wrote down the sentence exactly as Emily said it. As the crops continued to mature, Ben helped Emily contact several restaurants and grocery stores that had purchased vegetables from the farm before the disaster. Many owners were relieved to hear she was growing again. Some agreed to place advance orders for the upcoming harvest, even before the produce was ready. Emily carefully recorded each commitment in a notebook beside the kitchen phone. By the end of the week, the value of those advance orders exceeded her expectations. They would not make her wealthy, but they demonstrated that customers had not forgotten the Carter farm. Noah reviewed the growing list one evening and grinned. "You're going to need a busy harvest crew." Emily smiled back. "That's a good problem to have." Despite the encouraging news, one important date remained fixed in her mind. The bank's assessment was approaching. Every improvement on the farm, every donation, every volunteer hour, and every advance order would mean little if the bank decided the property was still too great a financial risk. Emily gathered receipts, donation records, repair invoices, and purchase commitments into neat folders, determined to present everything as clearly as possible. Grace helped organize paperwork, while Ben reviewed the rebuilding costs one final time. "You've done everything you could," he told her. Emily nodded, though uncertainty lingered. "I just hope it's enough." The evening before the scheduled visit, she walked alone through the rows of young vegetables. The breeze carried the fresh scent of healthy soil instead of floodwater. She paused near the rebuilt greenhouse and quietly thanked David for the life they had built together, believing he would have loved seeing the farm alive again. Early the next morning, Emily and Noah finished straightening the yard before waiting near the farmhouse porch. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when a dark sedan turned into the driveway and rolled slowly toward the house. A man in a navy jacket stepped out, carrying a leather folder, looked across the recovering farm, and introduced himself as the representative from the bank. The bank representative introduced himself with a polite handshake before asking Emily to show him the property. She walked beside him through the greenhouse, across the repaired fencing, and into the vegetable fields where young crops stretched in tidy green rows. Noah followed quietly, carrying a folder filled with receipts, donation records, invoices, and copies of advance purchase agreements. The representative stopped often, making notes and taking photographs. He examined the rebuilt drainage system, inspected the greenhouse, and asked practical questions about projected harvest yields, operating costs, and repayment plans. Emily answered each one honestly. She never exaggerated what had been accomplished or ignored the challenges that still remained. When they returned to the farmhouse, she spread the documents across the kitchen table. The representative carefully reviewed the paperwork, paying particular attention to the community donations and the signed purchase commitments from local restaurants and grocery stores. "You've had remarkable support," he observed. Emily smiled softly. "I couldn't have done any of this alone." After nearly an hour, he closed the folder and looked at her. "Mrs. Carter, the flood caused serious damage. But what you've shown today is a realistic recovery plan, backed by measurable progress. Based on the repairs, community investment, and expected revenue, the bank will continue your loan under its current terms. Emily stared at him for a moment, hardly believing she had heard correctly. You're saying we can keep the farm? He nodded. Yes, we believe your operation has a viable future. Emily covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Noah wrapped his arms around his mother before she could even speak. Weeks of fear, uncertainty, and exhaustion seemed to leave them both at once. After the representative drove away, Emily stood quietly on the porch, looking across the fields that had nearly been lost forever. We did it, Noah said. She shook her head with a grateful smile. No, all of us did. News of the decision spread quickly through town. Grace arrived that afternoon carrying a pie, laughing before she even reached the porch. I had a feeling we'd be celebrating today. Pastor Daniel stopped by later with several volunteers who had helped rebuild the greenhouse. Their congratulations felt less like the end of a crisis and more like the beginning of something new. A few days later, Sarah returned to the farm to write a follow-up story. This time she found Emily harvesting the first baskets of lettuce and herbs from the greenhouse, while Noah loaded fresh produce into delivery crates. Sarah took photographs of the healthy rows before sitting down with Emily beneath the shade of an old maple tree. The last time I was here, Sarah said, you weren't sure the farm would survive. Emily looked toward the fields where volunteers had once shoveled mud. Neither was I, Sarah smiled. What changed? Emily thought about David's notebook, Grace's phone calls, Ben's encouragement, Pastor Daniel's volunteers, and every envelope that had arrived in the mail. People reminded me that kindness has a way of coming home, she answered. Sarah wrote the words down, knowing they captured the heart of the story better than any headline could. As summer progressed, deliveries from the farm resumed. Local restaurants praised the quality of the vegetables. Grocery stores increased their standing orders, and customers returned to the weekend farm stand in numbers Emily had never experienced before. The encouraging demand created an unexpected challenge. By the end of each market day, nearly every basket of produce had been sold. Noah reviewed the order sheets one evening and frowned. We're turning customers away. Emily looked over the numbers herself. We simply don't have enough space to grow everything they're asking for. The problem was one she had never imagined facing, only weeks after believing she would lose everything. Even with the rebuilt greenhouse and restored fields, the farm had reached its limit. Ben visited the following afternoon to discuss future planting plans. After reviewing the sales figures, he smiled. You've officially outgrown this place. Emily laughed. That's a wonderful sentence to hear. Ben pointed beyond the eastern fence where another piece of farmland stretched toward the tree line. Did you know the Henderson property next door is for sale? Emily looked across the neighboring acreage. It was slightly larger than her own fields and had been well maintained for years before its owners retired. I assumed someone would buy it quickly, she said. Not yet, Ben replied. It's still available, and the asking price is reasonable. Emily admired the open land, but quickly shook her head. Keeping this farm was difficult enough. Buying more land isn't possible. That evening, Grace stopped by after hearing about the strong harvest and the growing list of customers. Emily mentioned Ben's suggestion with an amused smile, dismissing it as an impossible dream. Grace listened carefully before glancing toward the neighboring property through the kitchen window. Maybe impossible isn't the right word anymore, she said. Emily raised an eyebrow. Grace smiled knowingly. You've already seen what this community can do when people believe in something. Don't be surprised if they decide your next harvest deserves room to grow. The idea of expanding the farm seemed impossible at first, and Emily refused to let herself dream too far ahead. She had only recently escaped losing everything. Taking on more land felt irresponsible, no matter how encouraging the recent harvest had been. But over the following weeks, the steady stream of customers never slowed. Restaurants increased their orders again. The weekend farm stand regularly sold out before noon, even after setting aside vegetables for local food pantry donations. There was more demand than the farm could supply. One evening, Emily and Noah sat at the kitchen table, reviewing another list of unfilled requests. Noah smiled as he looked over the numbers. "A few months ago, we were wondering if we'd ever plant another seed," Emily laughed softly. "Now we're wondering where we'll grow the next one." Noah folded the papers and looked at his mother. "I meant what I said. I want to stay, not just this season. I want to build this with you." Emily reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Your father would be proud to hear that." The following Sunday, after church, Grace asked Emily to remain for a few minutes. Pastor Daniel, Ben, Sarah, and several familiar volunteers were gathered inside the fellowship hall. Emily assumed they were planning another community event until Grace placed a folder on the table. "What's this?" Emily asked. Grace smiled. "Open it." Inside were letters, pledges, and signatures from neighbors, local businesses, church members, and former customers. Some had contributed money, others had promised equipment, fencing materials, or labor. Ben pointed to the final page. "Together we've raised enough to help you purchase the Henderson property next door." Emily stared at the papers without speaking. "No," she whispered. "You already did too much." Grace gently shook her head. "Emily, listen to me. This isn't charity. This is a community investing in someone who has invested in all of us for years." Emily felt tears welling in her eyes again. "I don't know how I'll ever repay everyone." Pastor Daniel smiled warmly. "You already have. You've been doing it for years. You simply never kept score." Emily thought immediately of David's notebook resting safely in the farmhouse. Every page suddenly carried even greater meaning. With the community's support and the farm's improving income, the purchase moved forward. The neighboring property officially became part of the Carter farm before the next planting season. The additional acreage allowed Emily and Noah to expand their vegetable production, add another greenhouse, and create a small community garden where families could learn to grow their own food. Several raised beds were reserved for local schools, while another section supplied fresh produce directly to the food pantry David had quietly supported for so many years. The farm no longer belonged only to one family. It had become a place where people gathered, learned, and helped one another. Noah embraced his new role completely. He introduced efficient planting schedules, coordinated volunteer days, and worked closely with Ben to improve future harvests. Emily often smiled as she watched her son walking the fields with the same quiet confidence his father had once carried. The future she had feared losing now stood beside her every morning. Grace visited often, usually pretending she had simply come to check on the tomatoes while secretly making sure Emily remembered to rest. Ben remained a trusted advisor and supplier, refusing to let success change the friendship they had built over decades. Pastor Daniel continued organizing volunteer days each spring, though the work gradually shifted from rebuilding to mentoring young families interested in farming. Sarah returned one final time to document the transformation she had witnessed from the beginning, standing beside the expanded fields. She compared the photographs she had taken after the flood with the landscape before her now. The difference was remarkable. Where mud, broken fences, and silence had once filled the frame, endless rows of healthy vegetables now stretched toward the horizon. Children worked in the community garden while volunteers harvested produce nearby. Sarah lowered her camera and smiled. "I think people are going to ask me what the miracle was," she said. Emily looked around at the busy farm before answering. "Tell them the miracle wasn't money." Sarah waited. Emily continued, "It was people choosing to care about each other." Sarah nodded. "That's the story I wanted to tell from the beginning." A few days later, after the last deliveries had been loaded for the week, Emily returned to the farmhouse alone. She climbed to the small shelf where David's notebook had rested ever since the flood. Sitting on the porch as the evening sun settled over the fields, she slowly turned through the familiar pages one final time. Every name now carried a face she had seen again during the rebuilding. Every quiet act of kindness had returned in ways neither she nor David could ever have predicted. Near the final page, she found the sentence that had remained hidden beneath a folded receipt. In David's familiar handwriting were the words, "If a day ever comes when we need help, don't be afraid to accept it." That's how kindness keeps growing. Emily smiled through tears, closed the notebook, and held it gently against her heart. As the sun dipped lower, Noah called from the fields, waving for her to join the volunteers finishing the day's harvest. She walked toward them across land that now stretched farther than it ever had before the flood. Laughter echoed between the green rows as neighbors filled baskets together. Just as they had rebuilt the farm together, Emily paused for one last look across the thriving fields. The flood had taken nearly everything she owned, but it had revealed something far greater than she ever imagined. It showed her that the seeds of kindness she and David had planted for years had never disappeared. They had simply been waiting for the season when they were needed most. Surrounded by family, friends, and a farm larger than the one she had once believed was lost forever. Emily smiled as the golden light settled over the harvest, knowing she had not only rebuilt a business, but also rediscovered her faith in the quiet goodness of ordinary people.